Dog finds something in the lake that will break your heart. Max darted into the water without warning, his paws kicking up small waves. Lucas barely registered it at first, too lost in his thoughts, until he heard the frantic splashing. The dog was swimming hard, as if something had caught his attention beneath the surface. Lucas stood still on the shore, watching Max with a mix of annoyance and curiosity. "Max, come on," Lucas muttered, half-hearted, half-amused. "What are you doing?" But the dog didn't respond. He swam further into the lake, pushing himself harder with each stroke, his tail slicing through the water. Something about it felt off. Max was a retriever, a natural swimmer, but he'd never been this determined. Lucas squinted, trying to make sense of it, when suddenly Max surfaced, a strange bundle clutched in his mouth. "What the?" Lucas stepped forward, his heart rate picking up as he realized the dog wasn't playing. Max was serious. The golden retriever paddled back, his eyes locked on Lucas as he brought the object to shore. Lucas hesitated. He hadn't expected to spend his Saturday morning fishing some random object out of the lake. But Max dropped it at Lucas's feet, shaking the water off his fur as if expecting him to do something. The package was wrapped in what looked like old, tattered leather. It was soaked through, but there was no mistaking the strange weight of it in Lucas's hands. "Good boy," Lucas muttered, although he was more confused than grateful. He looked at Max, who was wagging his tail, waiting for praise. But his gaze lingered on the object. The leather was frayed at the edges, and it was tied with a thick rope that seemed to hold it together against the water. Something about it felt wrong. Lucas knelt down, inspecting it closer. His fingers traced the rope, his thoughts a whirlwind. "What is this?" Max whined softly, nudging his nose against Lucas's leg. Lucas didn't answer. He could feel his curiosity overtaking his sense of logic. The knot was tied tight, but Lucas worked at it, finally loosening the rope. Inside, wrapped in the soaked leather, was a small, aged book, its cover worn and crinkled from years of exposure to water, but unmistakable. A journal. His father's journal. The breath caught in Lucas's chest as the realization hit. His heart hammered in his ears, and he felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He glanced down at Max, whose eyes were unblinking, as if the dog knew exactly what had just been uncovered. Lucas couldn't move for a moment. He didn't know what to do with the journal in his hands, let alone how to deal with the flood of emotions that were now threatening to break through the dam he had built around them for so long. He stood up, pocketing the journal, as if doing so would somehow keep the gravity of the moment at bay. "Let's go home, Max," he said softly, his voice a little unsteady. The dog wagged his tail again, turning back toward the path. But Lucas's mind was already far ahead, lost in the mess of memories and questions that had just resurfaced, unanswered and waiting. Lucas didn't waste time heading home. He didn't need to. Max trotted ahead, his tail wagging with the same enthusiasm as when they had left the house earlier, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing inside his owner. Lucas's hand remained wrapped around the soggy journal, the leather still cool to the touch but heavy with meaning. He hadn't dared open it yet, not wanting to face whatever secrets it might hold. When they got back to the small house Lucas had grown up in, he let Max inside first, giving himself a moment to breathe. The familiar smells of coffee and old furniture lingered in the air. It was a place frozen in time, a place that had held too many memories, both bitter and sweet. He couldn't remember the last time he truly felt at home here, not since his father's death. Now the house seemed like a prison, silent, suffocating, filled with ghosts. He set the journal down on the kitchen table and stared at it. His fingers lingered over the cover, tracing the worn edges as if trying to prepare himself for the emotional weight of what lay within. But he wasn't ready. He wasn't even close. Max, sensing his distress, padded up to him and nudged his leg, whining softly. Lucas bent down and scratched the dog's head absently. Max always seemed to know when Lucas needed him the most, never demanding more than a touch or a glance. "Good boy," Lucas muttered, more to himself than the dog. He turned his attention back to the journal, opening it slowly. The first page was dated from years ago, before his father's health had begun to deteriorate, before the car accident that had taken him from them. The handwriting was sharp and confident, full of life. But as Lucas read, the words began to blur, and an unspoken tension settled in the room. His father had been writing this for him, hadn't he? Lucas's throat tightened as he read the familiar ink. "I'm not perfect, but I hope you understand." He flipped through the pages quickly, his stomach sinking as he saw more entries, more letters to him, each one more intimate, more vulnerable than the last. They weren't just entries about daily life, they were about his father's regrets. The weight of his failures as a parent. The pain of losing his wife, Lucas's mother, when he was just a boy. The journal was full of apologies Lucas had never received. "I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed me the most," one entry read. "I failed you, Lucas, but I never stopped loving you." Lucas's hand trembled as he held the page, his emotions starting to unravel. How many times had he wished for those words when his father was still alive? How many times had he longed for an apology, for his father to acknowledge the distance between them? And now it came too late, in the form of a waterlogged journal, pulled from the depths of a lake. Max, as if sensing the shift in the room, padded over and sat beside Lucas, resting his head on his knee. Lucas looked down at the dog and then back at the journal. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I didn't know." The ache in his chest grew stronger as he continued reading, page after page. His father's words were raw, filled with regret and love, but they came too late to heal the wound that had festered between them for years. Lucas's anger flared briefly. Why hadn't he known? Why hadn't his father opened up to him when he was still alive? But beneath the anger, something else stirred, something softer, more painful: grief. He couldn't keep reading. Not yet. Lucas closed the journal, his heart heavy with a weight he couldn't explain. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as if a part of him had been stripped away by the words on those pages. But Max was there, his warm presence a steady comfort. And for the first time in a long while, Lucas didn't feel so alone. He stood up slowly, Max following at his heels. The weight of the journal felt heavier than before. Lucas didn't know where this would lead him, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't ignore it any longer. "Come on, Max," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "Let's go for a walk." Max gave a small bark, tail wagging, oblivious to the turmoil in Lucas's mind. And for that brief moment, Lucas felt the faintest glimmer of peace. The walk didn't help. The fresh air, the crunch of leaves beneath his boots, Max's constant wagging tail, none of it could clear the fog in Lucas's mind. The journal was still burning a hole in his chest, its weight heavier than anything he had ever carried. Max trotted ahead, blissfully unaware of the turmoil that had gripped his owner. Lucas just let his feet guide him, not really caring where he was going. It wasn't until they reached the edge of the forest, near the lake again, that Lucas finally stopped. The water looked different now, darker somehow, as though it held the secrets that had just been unveiled. Max circled around him, sensing something was off, and sat down quietly beside him, his gaze fixed on Lucas. Lucas stared at the water, trying to steady his breath. He had been walking for hours, but the pain in his chest had only deepened. He had spent so many years carrying around his father's absence, but now he was carrying something else, something far worse than the silence his father had left behind. The realization that his father had known exactly how Lucas felt all along. The journal had made that clear. His father's words echoed in his mind, "I failed you, Lucas." And yet, the journal also revealed the depth of his father's love, a love that Lucas had never fully understood or appreciated. His father's regrets were written in every page, each one more haunting than the last. But what was the point now? Lucas couldn't change the past. He couldn't bring his father back. He couldn't even ask him the questions that had plagued him for years. And the anger that had been buried for so long, began to resurface, not against his father but against himself. He had wasted so many years. He had shut his father out when he could have tried to understand him. He had pushed him away when all his father had wanted was a chance to make it right. Max nuzzled against his leg as if offering comfort, but Lucas couldn't bring himself to respond. How could he? The dog had no answers. Nobody did. He sat down on the cold ground, his back resting against a tree, the journal heavy in his hands. His eyes traced the pages once more, searching for something that would make it all make sense. But all he found was more of the same. More apologies. More unspoken words. It was almost unbearable. "Why didn't you just say it?" Lucas muttered to the journal. "Why did it have to be like this?" Max whined softly, his head tilted as if trying to understand. Lucas reached down absently and scratched his dog's head. The gesture was automatic, but the touch was grounding, like a tether to reality. Max's presence, so simple, so unwavering, was the only thing that had remained constant in Lucas's life. No questions, no judgments, just companionship. Lucas closed his eyes for a moment, letting the tears come. He didn't want them to. He hadn't wanted to cry since the day his father died. But now, in this moment, they came anyway, slow and steady, like the rain that sometimes fell without warning. It was a grief he hadn't allowed himself to feel. It was a grief he didn't know how to process. The sound of the water lapping against the shore seemed louder now, a constant reminder of everything he had lost. and everything he had never truly known. He had kept his pain buried for so long that now, even when he was finally confronting it, it felt like too much to bear. But there was no turning back. Not now. "Dad," Lucas whispered, his voice raw. "I don't know what to do with all this." Max gave a small bark as though trying to encourage him, but Lucas only shook his head. There was no easy fix. No magic words to make it all better. It wasn't just about understanding his father's pain. It was about understanding his own. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. He couldn't keep running from this. He couldn't keep hiding behind the walls he'd built. Not anymore. For the first time in years, Lucas felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile thread that told him maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. He didn't know how yet, but with Max by his side, he wasn't as alone as he had been. Slowly, Lucas stood up and took a step toward the lake. He felt the weight of the journal in his hands, but he also felt something else, a tentative resolve. He couldn't undo the past. But maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to heal from it. "Come on, Max," he said, his voice quieter now, more certain. "Let's go home." Max barked in agreement, and together they walked back toward the path, leaving the lake behind. But this time, Lucas didn't feel like he was walking away from something. He felt like he was walking toward something he hadn't been able to see until now. By the time Lucas returned home with Max, the sky had begun to darken, a reminder that the day was slipping away, just as his own sense of time had seemed to do since the journal's discovery. He sat on the couch, Max at his feet, his mind still churning. The journal had opened doors, but the house, this place, felt like it was suffocating him now. The words, his father's words, still echoed in his mind. The grief hadn't subsided. It never would. Lucas's gaze fell to the journal resting on the table. He hadn't even gotten past the first few pages, each one filled with painful confessions. His father had left him so much love, regret, confusion, but none of it had been in person. Not until after he was gone. The guilt started to creep back in, seeping into his thoughts. Why hadn't I seen it? Why didn't I try harder? With a heavy sigh, Lucas reached for the journal, his fingers trembling slightly. He had to keep reading. He needed to understand. Maybe, just maybe, there was something in those pages that could make this pain feel like it had a purpose. As he flipped through the pages, something else caught his attention. At the end of the journal there was a letter. It wasn't long, but it was different from everything else his father had written. This letter was personal. It wasn't an entry in the journal. It was a direct message to him. Lucas hesitated, his heart racing. The letter seemed to glow in the dim light of the room, as if the words themselves were alive with emotion. He took a deep breath and unfolded the fragile piece of paper. "Lucas," it began, the familiar handwriting looking so much like his father's that it felt like he was seeing him again, standing right in front of him. "I know you may never read this. I know it may be too late. But I need you to know." Lucas stopped reading for a moment, his throat tightening. Too late. His father had known that it was too late. Lucas could feel the sting of those words already. He pushed the tears back, refusing to let them fall, but they came anyway, hot and fast, blurring the words on the page. "I never wanted to hurt you. I know I failed you as a father. I know I wasn't there when you needed me most. But I loved you, Lucas. I loved you more than anything in this world." Lucas paused, his chest tightening. It was the words he had been waiting for, yearning for, and yet they felt foreign now, untouchable. It was too late. His father's apology, his confession, it was all too late. But at the same time it wasn't. Max whimpered softly at his feet, sensing the shift in his owner's mood. Lucas reached down and petted the dog's head, finding a small comfort in the familiar warmth. Max had always been the one constant in his life. Max never judged him, never made him question the things he'd done. And now, Max was the only one who understood. Lucas wiped his eyes quickly, taking another deep breath, and continued reading. "I'm sorry for the distance between us. For the silence I forced upon you. I thought I was protecting you, but all I did was build a wall between us. I hope, in time, you can forgive me. I hope, one day, you'll be able to see that I was doing the best I could, even when I didn't know how to be the father you needed." The weight of the letter was almost unbearable, yet somehow liberating. His father had been broken too, in ways Lucas had never understood until now. He had thought his father's indifference was a choice, a rejection. But now, with these words, he saw it differently. His father hadn't known how to bridge the gap between them. He hadn't known how to fix the damage his absence had caused. "I hope you can forgive me," the letter finished. "I hope you can find peace, Lucas. I'll always love you. Always." Lucas let the letter fall from his hands, his mind reeling. It was as if his father had come back to speak to him, just when he had given up hope of ever hearing those words. And yet, even now it felt like a cruel joke. The apology that he had needed so desperately had arrived after the chance to forgive had passed. His father had loved him, but it didn't change the fact that he wasn't here. It didn't change the fact that Lucas had missed his chance to connect with him, to understand him. Max nuzzled his hand again, pulling him out of his spiraling thoughts. Lucas smiled faintly, though it was sad. He didn't have the answers. He didn't know how to move on from this. But for the first time, the weight of the anger and confusion seemed a little lighter. He didn't have to forgive his father all at once. He didn't have to have everything figured out now. But maybe, just maybe, he could start. "Let's go for a walk, Max," Lucas whispered, his voice still thick with emotion. Max barked happily and wagged his tail, already bounding toward the door as if to say, "I've got your back." And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. The walk was quiet, but this time it wasn't the oppressive silence of grief. It was different. It was softer, a kind of tentative peace, a space where Lucas could let the weight of his father's letter settle. He hadn't said much to Max, just a few soft murmurs, a whispered word here and there. But the presence of his dog beside him felt like a reassurance that he wasn't walking this path alone, no matter how heavy it felt. They made their way toward the park, a familiar place from Lucas's childhood. It was the place where he and his father had come on weekends, just the two of them. Back then it had felt simple, comfortable. Lucas could still remember the laughter, the sound of his father's voice, the warmth of his hand on his shoulder. But now it was all muted like a faded memory. Max tugged on the leash as they neared the old swings, the rusty chains creaking in the wind. Lucas let the dog lead him and they stopped under the old oak tree. He stood there for a moment, the familiar scent of the park almost overwhelming him. It was like stepping into a past that felt both distant and painfully close. He hadn't realized until now how much he had missed the feeling of being anchored to something, anything. The loss of his father had left a void that no one could fill. But this place, these memories, they still had a pull on him. Sitting down on the grass, Lucas let out a long breath, leaning back against the trunk of the oak. Max curled up beside him, content to simply be there. The dog didn't need words. He never did. Lucas looked out across the park at the children running around, the families laughing together. He felt a pang in his chest, a sharp reminder of the things he would never have with his father. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't resentful either. He was simply sad. And that sadness felt like something he could finally begin to accept. For so long he had been running from it, burying it beneath the surface with work and distractions. He'd pretended to be fine, even as the weight of his father's absence pressed heavier on his chest each year. But today the sadness wasn't something he had to fight. It just was. And that was okay. He pulled the journal from his bag, the weight of it almost comforting now, and flipped it open again. His father's words were still there, still haunting him, but now they didn't feel so foreign. He could almost hear his father's voice in his mind as he read each sentence. "I hope you can forgive me, Lucas. I hope you can find peace." Lucas closed his eyes for a moment, taking in the stillness of the park, the wind brushing against his face. Maybe this was a start. Maybe he didn't have to have all the answers. He didn't need to understand everything about his father's pain or his own. But he could let it breathe. He could allow it to be a part of him without letting it consume him. Max lifted his head, his ears perking up, and Lucas followed his gaze toward the horizon. There was nothing spectacular about it, just the simple beauty of a quiet afternoon. But in that moment, it felt like everything had come full circle. Lucas was still here. He had survived the worst of it. And now, with Max by his side and his father's words echoing in his heart, maybe it was time to start moving forward. The letter had said, "I hope you can forgive me." And maybe that was the next step. Maybe Lucas didn't need to forgive all at once. But he could start. He could begin to let go of the anger that had built up over the years and in its place, make room for something else. Understanding. Max nudged his hand, bringing Lucas back to the present. The dog's eyes were soft, full of trust, as if he knew exactly what was going through Lucas's mind. "You're right, Max," Lucas said, a soft smile tugging at his lips. "We're in this together." It wasn't a perfect moment. There would still be days of uncertainty, of grief that came rushing back. But for now it was enough. He wasn't running anymore. He wasn't hiding from the pain. He was facing it one step at a time. The afternoon stretched on, and Lucas felt a quiet peace begin to settle over him. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a first step, toward healing. "Let's head back home," Lucas whispered, his voice steadier than it had been in days. Max barked in response, tail wagging, and they began to walk back down the path side by side. And for the first time in a long while, Lucas didn't feel so alone. The next few days were a blur. Lucas had returned to work, but nothing seemed the same. He moved through the motions of his daily routine, checking emails, attending meetings, making small talk with coworkers, but his mind kept drifting back to that letter, to the journal, to everything he had discovered about his father in the past week. It felt like the world had shifted beneath him, but he hadn't yet found his footing. Max was always there, though, always waiting for him at the door, ready to offer the kind of unconditional companionship Lucas didn't even know he needed. The dog's presence was a quiet comfort, a gentle reminder that he wasn't alone in all of this. It was hard to explain, but Max was the anchor that kept him tethered to the present. Every walk, every moment spent together, felt like a small step toward the healing he wasn't sure how to find. One evening, as Lucas was scrolling through old photos of his father on his phone, something caught his eye. A picture of the two of them at the park, just like the one he had visited with Max. It was a picture from when he was a child, maybe 8 or 9 years old. His father had been smiling, laughing, his arm around Lucas's shoulders as they both looked toward the camera. The image sent a wave of emotion crashing over Lucas, and for the first time in days he felt a deep, aching sense of regret. He could still remember how, at that age, he had looked up to his father with admiration, without any hint of the bitterness that had come later. Back then there had been no walls, no distance. They had been a team. But somewhere along the way things had changed. The laughter had faded, the distance had grown, and Lucas had shut down. He stared at the picture for a long time, the emotions swirling inside of him like a storm he couldn't quite control. His fingers hovered over the phone screen, hovering over the button to delete it. But he couldn't. He couldn't erase the memory. He couldn't erase the man his father had been in those rare moments of closeness, when the world felt simpler, before everything had become so complicated. He reached for the journal, setting the phone aside, and opened it once more. The words inside seemed to speak louder now, each sentence cutting through him like a blade. "I thought I was protecting you," his father had written. "But all I did was build a wall between us." Lucas's eyes stung. His father hadn't just been absent. He had been trying to protect him in his own flawed way. And yet, it had backfired. It had pushed Lucas further away, until there was nothing left but silence and regret. Max padded over to him, his head resting gently on Lucas's knee, as if to remind him that he wasn't alone. Lucas absent-mindedly scratched Max behind the ears, finding some comfort in the simple gesture. But as much as Max's loyalty meant to him, it wasn't enough to ease the sharpness of his regret. He closed the journal again, taking a deep breath. The weight of it all, his father's love, his mistakes, his own failures, was starting to settle more heavily on him. The truth was, he didn't know how to forgive himself. How could he? He had let the bitterness of his youth drive a wedge between him and his father. He had been too proud, too angry to see the love his father had tried to show him. The doorbell rang, pulling Lucas out of his thoughts. He wiped his eyes quickly, trying to compose himself, but the feeling of heaviness lingered. He opened the door to find his sister, Emma, standing on the other side, holding a small box. "Hey," she said softly, her expression a mix of concern and warmth. "I thought you might want this." Lucas raised an eyebrow, glancing at the box in her hands. "What's this?" "It's from Dad's things," she explained. "I found it while going through his stuff." She handed the box to him, her eyes meeting his with a silent understanding. "I thought it might help." Lucas took the box from her, the weight of it unfamiliar, like it was holding a part of his father he hadn't been ready to face. "Thank you," he murmured. Emma gave him a gentle smile, though it was clear she was still worried about him. "I know it's hard," she said quietly. "But you're not alone. We're in this together." Lucas nodded, but as Emma turned to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something. Something that could either bring him peace or drag him deeper into the darkness of regret. He closed the door behind her and sat down at the kitchen table, the box still in his hands. His heart was pounding in his chest, unsure of what he would find inside. Max sat at his feet, watching him closely, his loyal eyes filled with quiet understanding. The dog's presence was the only thing that felt certain in this moment, and Lucas clung to it like a lifeline. He took a deep breath and opened the box. Inside was a small stack of letters, carefully tied together with a fraying ribbon. Lucas's fingers trembled as he reached for the first one. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable. It was his father's. With a mix of fear and anticipation, Lucas broke the seal. Lucas sat frozen, the envelope in his hand, the weight of it both familiar and foreign. His father's handwriting was a tangible connection to the past, to a man who had always been out of reach in so many ways. As his fingers traced the ink, a familiar sting of pain gripped his chest. His heart raced. What was inside this letter? Another apology? Another attempt at reaching out from beyond the grave? He hesitated. He had already read the journal, the painful admissions of guilt his father had left behind, but this felt different. This letter felt more intimate, more personal. It wasn't part of the confessions or the explanations. It was meant for him, just for him. Max nuzzled his leg gently as though urging him to open it, to face whatever was inside. Lucas took a deep breath and broke the seal, pulling out the letter with a careful, almost reverent motion. He unfolded the paper slowly, his hands shaking as the words began to blur on the page. Lucas, it started, the familiar script giving him a momentary sense of comfort. But the words that followed weren't what he had expected. If you're reading this, then I am already gone. I'm sorry it's taken me so long to say this, but I've been afraid. Afraid of what you would think, afraid of what I would lose. But I need you to know something that I have never been able to say. Lucas's breath caught in his throat. He pressed his lips together, fighting to hold back the tears that had suddenly started to rise. His father had been afraid? After all this time, all these years of silence, it was fear that had kept him from speaking? I never wanted to be the kind of father who let his son down. I never wanted to disappoint you, to make you feel abandoned. But the truth is, Lucas, I was afraid of not being enough. I was afraid that if I gave you too much of myself, I would lose the little bit of control I had left. I was trying to protect you by keeping my distance, even when all I wanted was to be there for you. But the truth is, I didn't know how. Lucas's breath quickened as the weight of his father's words settled into him. Afraid of not being enough? Was that why he had distanced himself for all those years? Fear. Lucas had always thought it was indifference, that his father simply didn't care. But now, with these words, the reality seemed different. His father had been lost too, just as lost as he had been. I'm sorry, Lucas. I've failed you in more ways than I can count. But I want you to know that I love you. I always have and I always will. I hope one day when you are ready, you'll understand that this wasn't because I didn't care. It was because I loved you too much to hurt you any more than I already had. The letter shook in Lucas's hands. The tears he had been fighting finally came, falling silently down his cheeks. The words his father had written, "I love you, I always have," were the words he had longed to hear. But now that they had arrived, they brought a painful clarity. His father had loved him in his own way, but it had never been enough to bridge the gap between them. The distance had always been there, a wall Lucas couldn't see past. Max padded closer, resting his head on Lucas's knee, offering comfort without question. Lucas ran his fingers through the dog's fur, seeking solace in the simplicity of Max's presence. But it wasn't enough. The wound was still raw, the regret still gnawing at him. He had spent so many years feeling abandoned, angry, convinced that his father had chosen distance. And now, with the truth laid bare before him, all he could feel was the weight of what could have been. The letter continued, but Lucas's eyes were unfocused. He couldn't see the words anymore, just the images from his childhood. The park, his father's laughter, the quiet moments they had shared. All the things he had taken for granted, all the things he had missed while his father struggled in silence. His father had been human just like him. Flawed. Afraid. But it didn't change the fact that Lucas had spent so many years missing him, wishing he had been there, even though he hadn't known how to ask for that presence. I know this may never make up for the time we lost, the letter ended, but I hope in time you can forgive me. I'm sorry. I love you. Lucas let the letter fall to the table, his hands shaking. His chest tightened as the reality of the situation settled over him. Forgiveness. His father had asked for it, but could he truly give it? Could he forgive the man who had been absent when he needed him most? Could he let go of the years of resentment, of feeling like he had been left behind? Max nuzzled his leg again, his quiet, steady presence offering a comfort Lucas didn't know how to explain. He reached down and scratched the dog's ears, his heart heavy but strangely at peace. Forgiveness wasn't easy. It wasn't something that could be given away with a single breath or with a letter written too late. But maybe, just maybe, it was something he could work toward. A step at a time. Thank you, Dad, Lucas whispered softly as if his father could hear him. I'll try. I'll try to forgive you. And for the first time in years, Lucas didn't feel so lost. The path ahead wasn't clear, but at least he was ready to walk it. With Max by his side, maybe he could start to heal. Maybe one day he could look at his father's memory without so much pain. But for now he had taken the first step. And that, he thought, was enough. The days that followed felt like a delicate balance between light and shadow. Lucas tried to find normalcy in the routine of work and the quiet evenings spent with Max. But there was a shift within him, something fundamental had changed. It was as if he was moving through the world in a different way, seeing things with a new kind of clarity, but still carrying the weight of the past on his shoulders. He found himself thinking more often about his father's letter. The words "I love you" kept echoing in his mind, but it was no longer just about hearing them. It was about understanding them, accepting them, about realizing that love had always been there, even when it hadn't been expressed the way Lucas had needed it. His father had loved him in the best way he knew how, even if it had hurt. And now, Lucas had to learn how to accept that love, imperfect and unfinished as it was. One evening, as Lucas sat at the kitchen table, a quiet weight settled on him. He was alone, the house silent, save for the soft ticking of the clock. Max was curled up at his feet, the faint sound of his breathing a calming presence in the otherwise still air. Lucas looked down at the journal and the stack of letters his father had left behind. He hadn't read all of them. The words were too raw, too overwhelming, but now he felt ready to confront them. Maybe it wasn't just about forgiveness. Maybe it was about understanding the journey that had led his father to the place where he had finally been able to write those letters. He reached for the next letter in the stack, his fingers trembling as he picked it up. This one wasn't addressed to him. It was to his mother. The ink was faded, the edges of the paper frayed as if it had been read many times before. Lucas's breath caught as he realized that this letter had been written long before his father's death, before the regrets had piled up. It was a letter from a time when his father had still believed in something, before everything had started to unravel. Opening the letter, Lucas began to read, the words raw and unguarded. "I don't know how to begin this letter. There's so much I need to say, but the words always get caught in my throat. I've spent so many years not saying the things that matter, holding them back for fear of losing you, for fear of losing us. But if I'm honest, I've been afraid. Afraid that if I tell you everything I feel, it will be too late. Too late to fix the things I've broken. Too late to make up for all the things I didn't do." Lucas paused, his heart pounding in his chest. His father's words were raw, exposed in a way that he had never imagined. It wasn't the cold, distant man he had remembered. It was a man who had been carrying his own pain for years, silently, quietly, unable to share it. The letter went on. "I love you and I know that I've failed you in so many ways. I'm not proud of the things I've done, the things I've said. But I need you to understand something. It was never about not loving you. It was about not knowing how to be the man you needed. I hope that one day you'll see that my distance wasn't because I didn't care. I hope you'll know that I would have done anything to fix things, to make it right." Lucas's chest tightened as he read those words, the weight of them pressing down on him. His father had loved his mother, of that there was no doubt. But something had broken between them, something neither of them had known how to fix. The pain of that realization hit Lucas hard. All his life, he had believed his father's silence and distance were a reflection of his indifference, his inability to love. But now he could see it was more complicated than that. His father had been afraid of failing. Afraid of exposing his own vulnerabilities, and in doing so, he had built walls that were impossible to tear down. "I don't know if you'll ever read this," the letter concluded, "but if you do, I want you to know that I never stopped loving you. Even when I couldn't find the words, they were there. Always." Lucas set the letter down slowly, his hands trembling. His father's love for his mother had been there, buried beneath layers of pride, fear, and regret. He could see it now clearer than ever. But it still hurt, still stung to think about all the years that had been lost. The love, the potential, everything that could have been. Max lifted his head and placed a paw on Lucas's knee, offering his quiet comfort. Lucas reached down, running his fingers through the dog's fur. He didn't have the answers. He didn't know how to heal from all this pain, all this confusion. But he understood something now. He understood that love, no matter how deeply buried, could still exist. It was messy. It was complicated. But it was real. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to begin the process of healing. Lucas closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, the weight of the past and the present pressing against him in equal measure. The journey wasn't over. It might never be. But for the first time in a long time, he felt as though he was on the right path. He didn't need to have all the answers, didn't need to fix everything in one moment. He just needed to keep moving forward step by step. He glanced down at Max, whose eyes were soft and understanding. And with a small, almost imperceptible smile, Lucas whispered, "We'll be okay, won't we, buddy?" Max's tail thumped once, a quiet affirmation. Lucas chuckled softly, knowing that in this moment, that was all the answer he needed. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a warm golden light over the living room where Lucas sat, his fingers gently tracing the edges of the journal. Max was curled up by his feet, content in his quiet presence. It had been weeks since he'd opened the last letter, weeks since he'd begun to make sense of the storm of emotions inside him. But today felt different. Today felt like the beginning of something. He had spent so much of his life searching for answers, longing for the love and understanding that had always seemed just out of reach. And while his father's letters had brought him closer to the truth, they had also left him with more questions. But that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Maybe not all questions needed to be answered. Maybe the most important part of healing was learning to accept the uncertainty, to move forward even when the past didn't provide all the closure he had once thought it should. The dog lifted its head, sensing the shift in the room. Max's eyes met his with the same steady, unconditional gaze that had been there from the very beginning. Lucas had always thought that the bond they shared was something simple, something uncomplicated. But now, with everything he had learned, he realized that even this quiet companionship, was part of the healing process. Max had been there for him through all of it, the anger, the confusion, the loss. No words were needed between them. It was just a presence, a steady comfort in the face of the unknown. Lucas took a deep breath and stood up, walking to the small wooden table by the window. He had kept the letters close to him, kept them safe, but now it was time to let go of the weight they carried. He didn't need them to move forward. He didn't need to keep revisiting the past in order to heal. His father's words, though painful, had served their purpose. They had opened the door to understanding, but it was up to Lucas to choose what to do next. He took the stack of letters and placed them inside the box. The ribbon that had once tied them together now felt symbolic, like a reminder that all the threads of his father's love and regret were finally tied up. It was time to move forward, to live in the present, to allow himself to grieve the lost years, but to also embrace the possibility of something new. Max padded over to him, nudging the box with his nose as if to say, "It's time." Lucas smiled softly and sat down on the couch, pulling the dog up beside him. He held Max close as if to give thanks for the quiet moments they shared. The dog's warmth was a steady reminder that love in its purest form was right in front of him, and that was enough. There would be difficult days ahead, days when the past would rear its ugly head and the regret would feel unbearable. But there would also be good days, days when the sun would rise and he would step outside, feeling the weight of his choices, of his healing, but no longer suffocating under it. Days when he could love freely, when he could embrace the future with all its uncertainties. For the first time in a long while, Lucas felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't clean, but it was real. He could finally see it, this new path he was on, not defined by the mistakes of the past but shaped by the courage to move beyond them. The journey of healing wasn't a straight line, and it wasn't something that could be completed in an instant. But with each step, Lucas was learning to forgive himself, to embrace the love his father had tried to give, and most importantly, to accept that love in all its messy, imperfect forms. He reached for his phone and dialed his sister Emma's number. The call went through and she picked up on the second ring. "Hey Lucas," she said, her voice bright and warm. "Hey," Lucas replied, his smile genuine. "I've been thinking a lot and I just wanted to say, thank you. For everything. For being here. For understanding." Emma's voice softened. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad you're doing okay." "I am. I really am." "It's going to take time, but I'm okay," Lucas said, feeling the weight of his words settle in his chest. The conversation shifted to familiar topics: plans for the weekend, how their mom was doing, and if they should take Max to the park. But beneath it all, there was a newfound understanding, a deeper connection between them that hadn't been there before. When the call ended, Lucas set the phone down and looked at Max, who was still resting by his side, content and loyal. "We've got this, buddy," Lucas said softly, his voice filled with quiet determination. And in that moment, with the sun setting and the future still uncertain, Lucas felt ready. Ready to live fully, to love fully, and to embrace whatever came next. For the first time in a long time, the world felt like a place where healing was possible. And with Max by his side, Lucas knew he wasn't facing it alone. As we walk through the shadows of our past, we often forget that healing isn't about having all the answers. Sometimes, it's about understanding that love, though imperfect, was always there, quietly waiting to be seen. Lucas's journey reminds us that forgiveness isn't a destination, but a path we choose to take, step by step, even when the weight of the past tries to pull us back. If this story touched your heart, let it echo in someone else's too. Like, comment, and share, because we all carry stories of pain and hope, and together we can heal. And if you want to keep discovering more powerful, emotional journeys, don't forget to subscribe. Your next story might just be waiting here.